morning to everyone who's just joined. Just waiting for a few more attendees to connect into this webinar and then we'll get started. We might get started. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather to meet today and pay my respect to the elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So by way of introduction, I'm Paul Newman. I'm a partner in the Energy and Resources practice at Ashurst. For about the last 30 years, I've serviced clients in the energy and resources sector, especially those involved in the electricity and renewables energy industries. I've seen an amazing evolution in the transformation from conventional energy to renewables in that period, and we have a big transition ahead of us still, and particularly have experience in areas of renewable generation over the last 4 or 5 years, and also battery storage projects and pumped hydro. Today, we have a great lineup of speakers, which I'm sure will be a really interesting discussion, which goes to the robustness of the energy grid in the context of powering satellite cities. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel. From Transgrid, we have Ava Hanley, who is the Executive Manager of Strategy and Innovation. Joining us from Vinci Energies is Mauricio Mora, who is the Head of Commercial and New Markets. From Schneider Electric, we have James Hunt, who is Vice President of Power Systems. And from ENEA Australia, we have Olivia Lacroix, who is a partner of ENEA Consulting, managing their operations in Australia. So our panelists have a unique perspective on the context of grid robustness, so hopefully we'll come away with some interesting takeaways on emerging trends. Before I commence, just to remind you, this is a live presentation as part of the French-Australian Chamber of Commerce conference, and we have a live Q&A chat on the side of the screen, so feel free to submit questions through the chat function, and we will aim to answer questions in the last 15 minutes of this session, and I see that somebody's already welcomed us using the Zoom chat, so thank you very much. So before I sort of turn to each of the presenters, I thought it would be useful just to set the scene. I think as most of the people who are attending today would realise that we are on the wave of a significant transition of our energy system. And I think when you look at the statistics, it's already clear it's happening. So in the national electricity market, which has a generation capacity of about 55 gigawatts, since 2014, we've seen 4.5 gigawatts of coal retired, and another 2 gigawatts will retire in 2022. And if you look at the AEMO website, you'll slowly see coal basically exit the system from around by 2045, with a number of retirements in the 2030s. So classic, we have an aging coal fleet in the NEM. Same time, we've seen about 8.5 gigawatts of utility scale renewables installed in the period from 2017 to 2020. The statistics show that's about half and half wind and solar. And obviously there's a whole lot of new projects that are looking at installing not just wind and solar, but other technologies. Also, at the same time, we've seen a real growth in distributed energy, and obviously we'll be chatting a bit more about that today. In the NEM, we have over 13 gigawatts of residential rooftop solar, which is, when you think about the overall generating fleet of 55 gigawatts, that's a huge amount, and recognised as some of the highest penetration in the world. We've also seen the rise of residential and utility scale batteries, and Australia is certainly recognised as a world leader in the deployment of that technology. So things are definitely changing. Against that background, we've seen significant technical challenges and a myriad of regulatory responses. A centralised synchronous generation has been replaced by distributed asynchronous renewable generation. So a few things just to sort of point out from my observations is, last year we saw over 500 megawatts of renewable generation being constrained in Victoria for over 6 months, and a whole lot of new generation rollout delayed as a result of regulatory and technical responses. We've seen the development of the 2020 Integrated System Plan, which is a significant change in the planning process and the works that need to be done to support the transition. We've seen significant technical and pricing impacts on markets from the unregulated distributed energy. Against that background, we've seen a significant amount of foreshadowed change. It amazed me when a joint prioritisation framework was issued by Australian Energy Market Operator, the Australian Energy Regulator, Australian Energy Markets Commission, and the Energy Security Board. Said there are 35 different reforms for the electricity and gas market for implementation between now and the end of 2026, including key reforms, which we will chat about today. There's obviously the Energy Security Board post-2025 market design. So things to think about for that are things like the two-sided market, valuing and integrating distributed energy, transmission access. At the same time, we've got the coordination of generation and transmission investment market reviews. We have investigations into system strength frameworks and a whole myriad of other reforms, which when I sort of even talk to those, I feel fatigue with those sort of reforms. But I think given this transition and the impact on the grid and expectation on domestic energy supply, what I thought I would start to do was ask each one of our presenters to give a brief perspective on the issues arising as a result of the energy transition, and then we'll actually dig down to those and deal with some specific issues. So at this stage, I'm going to pass over to Ava Hanley for her perspective.
Thanks, Paul. Delighted to be here this morning with my fellow guests. You're right, the pace and scale of change in this sector is unprecedented in Australia. For those not familiar with Transgrid, we are the owner and operator of the transmission network here in the New South Wales and ACT. So in addition to the challenges you mentioned, Paul, and again, I feel exhausted as well when you list them, we also grappled with the floods, the devastating bushfires, and the impacts of the pandemic on the supply-demand mix just this year. So in combination, these have placed considerable stress on the energy system. We're planning for multiple time horizons. We need to ensure that we keep the lights on here. Apologies, just had a phone call come in. Now, during this time of transition from coal to renewables, as well as look to the future, both the medium and the longer term. Infrastructure, as you well know, has a very long lead time. And that's what my team at Transgrid is focused on. How we enable and facilitate the system to transition into a really complex and unknown future. So some of the things I grapple with, what are the emerging technologies that can increase reliability and decrease energy costs? What are the new areas of the value chain that we don't even know about yet? And how do we manage the transition issues that are emerging, such as system strength and disparate DER? And in addition, how do we plan for and understand some of the global megatrends that will probably disrupt the entire supply-demand mix? And when I talk about megatrends, I'm thinking about electrification of transport, deep decarbonisation, AI, and mass data. But most importantly for us is how we meet the expectations of consumers in this transition. We need a robust, connected grid as the backbone of the energy system, but this has to be at the lowest possible cost for energy prices and consumers. So Paul, I'm looking forward to discussing some of these more this morning.
Excellent, that's a great start. Olivia, I might just now pass to you.
Yeah, sure, thanks Paul. Hello everyone. So maybe a few words about who we are. So Enea is a strategy consultancy, and we support our client in maximizing energy transition opportunities. And so what we bring, and what I hope to bring this morning, is a global and independent perspective on energy transition, and built through our experience working across geographies and sectors, from oil and gas to power and industry, and also across technologies. I think a lot of the panelists today have a strong focus on the electricity sector, but I think and it's definitely an area where there is a lot of movement and a lot of change, but I think other technologies and sectors are also important and play a strong role in the energy transition from gas to bioenergy and hydrogen. And in the power sector in Australia, a good share of our work focuses on distributed energy resources, from large-scale storage to standalone power systems and microgrids. And in particular, we work with distribution networks across the country to help them tackle the challenges of the transition towards a decentralized power system. And as mentioned earlier by Paul, Australia is spearheading the shift to a more decentralized energy system, and is actually well on its way to become the country with the highest share of distributed energy in the world. So this is quite a hot topic, I think, and it's definitely at the forefront of what is happening globally. And what I find exciting is that it raises many questions of a lot of different nature, technical, regulatory, and also economic nature.
So Maurizio, I might pass to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the attendees and my fellow panel members. Just a little bit about the company. I work for Vinci Energy. So Mexum is a dedicated energy and electricity infrastructure company. Is in essence is a contractor acting in all aspects of infrastructure, including renewable generation, transmission, substation, distribution, and DER. We are part of a very large group called Vinci Group, who was in the media not long ago for a bit for an energy infrastructure company, which is part of our competitor, and it was quite renowned in the media. But in terms of what we're talking here today, I come from a perspective of a contractor and an investor. Our strategy is growth via acquisition. And we invest in a number of services companies for satellite cities and smart cities. We prospect all the time companies on power quality, hardware and software control services, and the like. And in terms of the issues that we face is how to participate of the burgeoning Australian market. In terms of the first wave that we observed in the utility scale renewables and the congestion in the network. The second wave now with enabling assets such as storage, battery and synchronous condensers, and the upgrade of the infrastructure through the interconnectors. And now the third wave, which has a lot to do with satellite cities in the rise of the and challenges in terms of split ownership of assets, and lack of clarity on revenue models for some of those assets. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Maurizio. James, I might now pass to you.
Excellent, thank you, and good to be here, and thank you to my fellow panel members. Look, my experience, I come from a couple of different perspectives, having worked in energy service companies, having worked in a gentailer, and now in an energy technology company. So for those that don't know Schneider Electric, Schneider is a global leader in energy management and automation with over 165,000 people globally. So we have a broad view and see a lot of different perspectives. We work with grid customers, so customers like Ausgrid, Endeavour, South Australian Power Networks use our software to run their network, and you'll find our equipment and automation throughout the network. We also work with renewable developers, mining, oil and gas, data centers, all the way through to homes. I think the perspective we bring is that we are on a transition to a future that is going to be more electric as we move away from direct combustion of fossil fuels, more decarbonised as we move to renewables and a strong focus on energy efficiency, decentralised as we change our energy systems to decentralised energy models, and more digitised as we move away from analogue systems to digital. And that's what's going to enable the transition for us to be more electric, more decarbonised, decentralised. So,
great.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. So I think, again, both the comments I made and the comments of each of the presenters, we've spoken really about the transition at a high level. So what I'd like to do is sort of perhaps get down into the detail a little more. Just a reminder that you're enabled to, on the chat function, post any Q&As, and I'm watching those Q&As, so I'll pick them up as we go. Let's talk a little bit more about the transition, and I'll start off with sort of utility scale generation and the impacts on the system. So given my very first transaction was the acquisition of the Gladstone coal-fired power station, we started with a long concept of a long backbone of centralized generation with a long backbone of transmission grid and then distributed energy from that point of view. Clearly, the particularly last 6-7 years have seen a significant change in that generation mix. And it's quite clear from all of the documentation that generation mix is going to continue. It won't be centralized. It will be much more distributed, even in the connection to both transmission and distribution networks, leaving aside distributed energy, which we'll talk about in more detail. We've seen different types of generation: wind, solar, pumped hydro, chemical, battery, have all been deployed so far. And obviously there's other technologies that are being talked about. We've seen significant issues with the system to cope with those changes. We've seen a new system of system strength impact assessment and processes arise, and a new paper issued just last month saying that's going to be reformed once again. We've seen the deployment of technology such as synchronous condensers, which we haven't seen in this country for many years. And we've got an ongoing debate about how, in fact, storage devices are used and how they can assist the system. So it sort of all begs the question, is the system coping with change? So I'm going to pose that question to each one of the panelists. So I'm going to start off again, Ava, with you, in particular, given your background in the transmission sector.
Thanks, Paul. So in answer to your question, is the system coping? Yes, but not for long and not very well. So we do see very clear signs of a system under significant stress. And that's predominantly because of the supply-demand mix becoming tighter. This is occurring because of a combination, as you rightly said, coal-fired power generation is retiring, and it's retiring faster than anyone had anticipated. So we just weren't prepared for it at a system level. There has been a rapid uptake in renewable generation. However, it hasn't been rapid enough to fill the gap that's been left and will be left in the future with the retirement of coal. And the third contribution to it is the changing climate. So we've had abnormal weather events such as the bushfires. And in addition to that, some really high summer temperatures, which in Australia means everyone turns on their air conditioning, and there's a huge demand on the system. Just by way, one example, on the 1st of February 2020, we had a peak summer demand record in any historical context. So as system operator, this was as close to a crisis as we had in recent years. We managed it, and of course, no one was the wiser. But in the future, if this temperature occurred again, and it occurred on a weekday rather than a weekend, when demand is higher due to an increase of people being at home and also commercial industrial use, or Liddell was not available, or there wasn't an interconnection between the states, we would see significant load shedding and likely blackouts. So what this tells us is the system is coping, but it's very fragile and we have an urgent and immediate need to ensure we have more robustness in the system.
I think that's a really well-made point, because I think as all of us know, we haven't talked about South Australia and the blackout there in 2016, but I think that sits behind a lot of the sort of discussions we're having now, and people are quite concerned about those. So, Olivia, I might throw to you and ask you to just also perhaps have a little bit of we'll talk a bit more about distributed energy, but the impact of distributed energy actually on the existing system.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree with Eva. I think the system is coping with the transition. I think what is most transformative at the moment in Australia is definitely in the power sector. But the lights are still on, and I think I have no doubt that they will remain on. Although I must say that the transition does make the job of a lot of people in the power sector a lot more interesting. And I think one of the reasons of all of the difficulties or all of the change that you highlighted in terms of regulatory changes, I think it's because the transition in the power sector goes against many assumptions that have underpinned the working of the power system for so long. And if I had to highlight two aspects that I think are important, the first one is from a technical perspective. I think both generators and consumers are stopping behaving like they used to be, and
we had an issue, I think, with
yeah, and I think Olivia's just frozen. So, Mauricio, I might pass to you, but I'll throw it in.
Associated with,
sorry,
there was a lot of unsaid things. Am I back on?
Yes, you are back on.
Okay, sorry. Where did you lost me?
You were talking about the two impacts, and I think the first one was the behaviour of consumers and generators, and I think that's a really apposite example.
Yeah. So I think the both generators and consumers are no more behaving like they used to, and there were a lot of unsaid assumption and unsaid fact that were associated with both generators and consumers. And in particular, the switch to DC inverted system is a good example of this. And the other fact is that energy is now flowing more and more on demand from consumers back to the transmission grid. And I think from the regulatory and pricing perspective, the Australian framework relies on changes to the system being marginal. And I think the transition is anything but. And so that does create potential for cost and price inefficiencies just because of the magnitude of the change we have and the relative inefficiency of some of the mechanism in place.
And Mauricio, I might pass to you, but you probably have a view a bit like I do, or an understanding. A lot of the work I do is helping particularly generators connect into the system, and there has been fundamental difficulties with that, and I think the Victorian situation bore that out. So maybe I'll ask you the question: do you think you're coping with the transition?
Thank you very much. Then in that renewable generation injection front, yes. Then in essence, the system is congested, and particularly in northwest of Victoria, southern New South Wales, and it has led to system strength issues, into particularly short circuit power. And that has led to a late requirement of synchronous condensers for a number of users. We have hands-on experience, let's say, installing the Total synchronous condenser. It provides, for the technical minds in the forum, it provides about 130 MVA short circuit power to a peak of 700. Is the largest single unit in Australia, and going back to the question, is the system coping? We see the system as a non-static, as an evolving, let's say, piece of infrastructure or general infrastructure, and our experience of the need, of the requirement for that equipment, the procurement process, it was not ideal. Let's say that's probably a way to describe it. There's lead times for the manufacturing of this equipment. Now we've covered for the transfer of that equipment, and also there's not really benchmarks for the commissioning of those particular pieces of equipment, of new equipment, from an AEMO point of view. Then from that perspective, let's say I will classify the system as coping by just coping. We do have another example more on the DR side, and is we have the largest smart lighting contract in Australia in the ACT. It pretty much covers everything: sensors, lights, communication systems, software, integrated working system. And we have tried to replicate that in other jurisdictions, by the fragmented ownership of assets and cash flows from capital expenditure, operating expenditure, and energy consumption, makes it very difficult to emulate that sort of solution. Yeah.
So, and James, I might throw to you, and I suppose from my perspective, the sorts of various issues we just heard is it almost begs the question. We say we're just coping, and I think that's a pretty fair assessment. But one of the things that I struggle with is then how do you encourage further development in what is a rapidly changing piece and a rapidly changing regulatory environment, which really sort of follows on from what Mauricio was talking about.
Yeah. Look, in terms of coping, I take on and agree with everyone's perception of it's only just coping. Of course, there's going to be bumps along the way, and stranded assets or solar farms that can't connect to the grid are some of the examples of those bumps. I think what we need to bear in mind is that we are talking about a fundamental overhaul of our electricity generation system. So it is turning it on its head, right? It was built for coal-fired generators and gas-fired generators to send power one way to consumers, with the understanding that consumers use whatever they want, and the generators will just match whatever the demand is. And I think where we're going now is we're going to a two-sided energy system where the generation will flex and the consumer load will have to flex. And there's examples in the media that we see of people talking about load shedding, or people having to shed load on peak days. I bring a slightly different perspective and say that's not necessarily a negative thing. It's actually a sign of a mature energy market, because we're trying to reduce the amount of capital or cost of the energy system to cope with those peak loads on the 1 or 2 days a year when they occur. And so it's a far cheaper proposition to have active energy management and demand response initiatives in those customers, whether they're residential with air conditioners or whether they're industrial, and that decreases the overall cost of the system to everyone. So I see it more as a sign of a mature energy market rather than a problem. And I think we need a shift in how we think about it. In terms of the regulatory change, yeah, look, I think probably not moving as quick as we'd like, but I think given what the ESB have come out in their 2025 plan, it's probably on the right path. It is, as I said, a fundamental change of the energy system.
There's no doubt about that. And James, I'll stay with you, because today's presentation is also, as part of the overall conference, we're looking at satellite cities. So just get a little bit of background from what you think is what are satellite cities and what do we mean? And then I might just ask you then to talk about what's different about energy supply to satellite cities versus other types of supply.
Yep, sure. Look, I think when we're talking about satellite cities, we're talking about those cities or towns that aren't the CBD Melbourne, CBD Brisbane, CBD Sydney, or they're those that are on outskirts, couple of 100 Ks. And I think why they're interesting is because the energy transition is different for them as it is for the CBD. They have different issues facing them in terms of reliability, of being at the edge of the grid. Eva mentioned the floods, and I guess at the start of the year we also saw the bushfires. And so the needs of those customers are different. And I think what we've seen post bushfires has been a lot more investment in localized generation, local reliability, and investment that will drive greater resilience for those towns. I think the shift in demographic we're seeing post-COVID with growth in satellite cities is also really interesting. And I think if we look at it another way, there's an opportunity there for those towns, right? We've just seen this week Matt Keane come out with the New South Wales energy zones. So that's kind of a $1.5 billion in rent, 9,000 jobs, 2 to 3 gigawatt hours of storage, all of which is proposed in regional areas, right? So New England, Central West and the South. And so I think there's a really good opportunity there for these towns as we move to a decentralized system. And that's New South Wales as an example, but it's the same in each of the states.
Yep. And I might pass to Mauricio. I suppose from that point of view, like James said, it strikes me there's opportunities in these types of environments which we don't have in the big CBD. So in fact, try out various things that will help support the transition.
Absolutely, Paul. There are a couple of big differences in satellite cities. One of them could be, let's say, if you have mining towns like Mount Isa at the edge of the system, you will have considerations on cost benefits between islanding the town versus creating a copper string, for argument's sake. We would also have examples like Far Eastern Victoria and Bairnsdale, where the network struggles to service those customers. Then you would have an opportunity there with legacy skilled workforce that could develop a microgrid or an islanded city. But it requires industry activity to support both cost and consumption, and it requires a technological fit. For example, you could have large-scale utility generation and batteries for mining deposits, but you could have, let's say in Gippsland, a waste-to-energy project, as it is the case, where the paper mill and other industrial uses produce ample raw materials. Then is one of those things that one size won't fit all, and there will be less attraction, as you described, because they're not in the centers of population like Sydney or Melbourne or others. Then if it's the mining industrial type town, then most likely you will have those stakeholders needing to participate of that event. If it's more just developing the opportunities of a local, more agricultural community, for instance, it really will require government intervention and incentives.
And I think that's then quite a neat segue to talk about distributed energy, because I think that's the other opportunity that we look at with satellite cities, because from that point of view, we see that personally, I see that in those new environments, there's an opportunity to do those sorts of things. But it does distributed energy in itself poses a quite interesting question as part of the energy transition. And obviously, as I started out, we've seen this huge growth of distributed energy, and I'm sure I'll be shot down, but I'm going to say it's largely been unplanned. It's driven by consumers who've decided that they want to do something from a climate point of view, from a pricing point of view, and quite happy to pay out a capital cost as opposed to have high energy prices. So it's been a very clear desire to participate in decarbonisation in their own personal way. But that in itself creates a whole lot of challenges, I think, in terms of how it fits with how we're managing the utility scale generation and how the grid is managing those things. Now, I'm going to start with you, Olivia, because I know you've written recently about distributed energy. So just get a bit of perspective from you on that proposition.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think DER, distributed energy resources, is definitely a hot topic, and I think at some point networks or the industry was worried about what was called the death spiral, with potentially everyone leaving the grid and all that. I think that is not something that people believe in anymore, and I think that's right. I think the distributed energy resources can complement the grid, but it's not going to replace it altogether. But it can definitely complement it and bring some additional value to the customer. And I think in terms of value that it can bring and the ways that I have in mind is in terms of reliability, and it has been highlighted already, and storage in particular can do that. Some distribution business are already starting to use storage for that very purpose, as the case in WA. and it can also avoid network reinforcement. So that's a way to, rather than putting more poles in the wire, you can manage the demand or manage what is on the right side of the constraint to avoid unwarranted cost. And sometimes standalone power system, which are named SAPs, can entirely replace the grid at its fringe in rural areas, and that can be done in a cost-efficient manner. So I think all of this shows that sometimes it can be a complement, sometimes it can replace some chunks of the grid, and that's new tools for the networks and the distribution networks to bring safe and reliable electricity supply to their customers. I think that, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things which you remarked upon, which I always find is an interesting part of the transition, is in fact, if you're looking at things like alternatives to just expanding the grid, so the battery support, etc. Do you have a perspective on whether we actually have the right regulatory settings and pricing and processes, things like obviously RIT-T, RIT-D, those types of things? Are they supporting it, or do we need to look at how to modify that?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think it's a lot better than in a lot of other countries. I think it can always be better, and in particular, I think it's so you got all that regulatory framework. You also have, I would say, habits. Habits is a force to reckon with, and the energy industry is relatively conservative as well. So sometimes doing things in a new way might be risky, and it's sometimes safe and boring can be good as well for the customers. I think, however, that the RIT and has pushed networks to look at these non-network options. I think some have taken advantage of them. I think in some cases it just doesn't make sense, and network is the best solution. But that opens an avenue for network to do this. There is also the DMIS scheme in Australia that adds some additional incentive for networks to move to these solutions. But I think it definitely brings the network into new territories, and in a way these sort of DER, whatever they may be, kind of go against all of the careful unbundling that has been driving the reform of the energy system for so long. I think like before we were in a vertically integrated world, usually monopolistic entities delivering everything from networks to generation to retail, and most of the reform have been to separate things between networks, poles and wires, retail and generation, to bring competition. And now we're saying, for instance, with SAPs, that actually the best thing to do is to bring it all together in a single system, and the supply and the wires kind of become indistinguishable from the energy generation. So I think it goes against, once again, a lot of the assumptions that are underpinning the regulatory framework, and that makes it an interesting and challenging journey. And there will be some new regulatory reform on this. The AER just published yesterday, I think, a study on the value of DER, which will bring some framework to reflect on how network should think about these sort of things. And there's been some recent rule change also around standalone power system, which were not really allowed before. So I think the regulation is changing and is made more ready to accept these sort of new ways of supplying electricity.
That's a really good perspective, and thank you, Olivia, for that. And Ava, I might actually pass to you. I suspect you might have a slightly different perspective in terms of the impact of distributed energy on the grid, and particularly management of transmission grids.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I do agree with the point you made, that I look at the rise in DER, and I think it's a really interesting trend. I agree that it shows the desire of consumers to have more control over their energy use and their cost, and also decarbonisation. Really, for me, I look at it from a whole system perspective. I mean, at the moment, DER is a drop in the ocean of what the power system needs in this country. So whilst I support it, it's most efficient when it's aggregated. So for example, we want all costs that are spent on energy infrastructure to be able to be leveraged as much as possible. So if it's aggregated and connected into either another aggregation or the grid, when there's excess energy, that energy should be used by someone else who needs it. And that's the most efficient use of the resources. We're seeing some really interesting developments with technology, with satellite cities. I mean, Broken Hill's a great example. So we connect Broken Hill via a 250-kilometre single line. Now, you can imagine there are times when that line goes down through storms or unplanned outages. And at the moment, it's backed up by diesel generators, which is inefficient and also high carbon usage. So we're looking now at providing that backup through large-scale storage devices. And so we are seeing the new technologies making a real difference in those more autonomous networks. But again, I like the idea of microgrids, and I love the idea of significant microgrids linked to each other and trading excess energy. But they do need to be connected into the larger system to make it most cost efficient.
So James, I might throw to you on that, because I think that's exactly what's at issue here, is in terms of how we actually manage the rise of distributed energy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the question around helping, hindering, I think is happening, and it's happening because it meets customers' needs. Right? Customers want reliability, they want affordability, and they want sustainability, and DER helps achieve those needs. The reference to microgrids is a great example. We're seeing more and more growth of microgrids as people want to take control of their energy, want to manage their energy consumption and reduce their cost. We've got the South Australian produce market, which has now been commissioned, which is a microgrid that has 2 and a bit megawatts of solar, 2 and a bit megawatts of battery, diesel generators. They're a wholesale market participant, so they have that direct exposure, and they're managing their risk from outages. They're also managing their financial risk, and I think it's a great example of someone that's taken that step, moved forward, and is demonstrated that it works. We have these globally, so our microgrid business is very mature in the US and Europe. It's growing in Australia as our own market progresses. I think the point around aggregation and the value that DER can provide is a really interesting one, because I don't think that the full value of DER is being realised. If we take that example of the produce market, they're managing the wholesale market position, they're managing their reliability. Now, there is potential value that they could provide to the network, but currently there's no way of realising that value. There's no way of the network calling on those DERs specifically to support the network. And I think that value stack is really what we need to have the right framework to get the most out of for customers.
So then I think, James, that sort of almost begs the question, the two-sided market that you posed, which the ESB is posing, things like the demand response mechanism that we have that actually kicks in October next year, and people can actually bid that into the system. You've got some interesting movement on that. And like you, I've always been struck by the fact that how do you value these things? And we've got a system that's about valuing centralised dispatch of wholesale generation. Yeah. Mauricio, I know you guys are involved in doing satellite cities and doing some of the microgrids, so it might be interested in your perspective.
Yes, I suppose I'll echo the thoughts from Olivier, Eva, and James, particularly on the concept of aggregation. Aggregation is fundamental not only to address the community needs and the technological needs, but for efficient market players to really participate on those spaces. You need certainty in your financial models to count on things like, if we're talking about the Broken Hill battery, then the investor would require certainty not only in arbitrage but also on ancillary services. Similarly, if you're doing smart city applications or microgrids, you need to make sure that if you have any sort of ancillary services on power quality control and monitoring for the distribution business, that you're rewarded for those services, and that you can project that in your financial modeling. Then perhaps the two examples that I have is again, I already mentioned the ACT smart lighting concept, which could extrapolate to smart city. And I really commend the South Australian efforts. South Australian government is now grouping smart precincts for rollout of microgrids. But then if they do it at precinct level, then it will have the economies of scale to attract investment in the supply chain.
That's it. Mauricio, thank you for that. And certainly to me, it's an interesting opportunity. And I think a lot of the reform around these things really are looking at how you can integrate all of these facilities, which traditionally have not been integrated, which I think actually that sort of discussion sort of goes in part to answer the sort of next area I wanted to talk about, but is really, we've identified that we're coping maybe just with what we have at the moment. We recognise that we've got the rise and the continuing rise of distributed energy. We've certainly got the fundamental change in the nature of what is our utility scale power generation, and the opportunity for some really interesting sort of technology to be applied. So in some ways, sort of pose the question to this group around sort of what are the solutions over the next, say, probably 5 to 10 year time horizon that needed to achieve a robust energy grid to support this, and probably to the extent you can, and I appreciate not all of you are sort of from a policy point of view are able to do this, but whether in fact some of the reforms and the processes like the ESB process are really taking us in the right direction. So Ava, I might start with you if that's okay.
Thanks, Paul. So in terms of the solutions, in my view, there are three really important ones that will make the most difference. The first are the interconnectors connecting the states that are outlined in AEMO's integrated system plan. So for those of you who are energy nerds like myself, you may have the NEM data app installed on your phone, and you may look at it a lot during the day. What this does, it enables you...
I think.
Yeah, that's right. There's no shame in it. It enables you to look at the supply and demand and cost of energy in real time in each state. And when you watch this, you notice how dramatically different they are. So just yesterday, for example, I saw the wholesale price in South Australia of around $8. At the same time, in New South Wales, it was $30. So if we had Project Energy Connect in place, which is one of the interconnectors that we're currently looking at building, the price of electricity here in New South Wales would have been dramatically reduced, because we would have been able to use the excess energy that South Australia didn't need. So in my view, without these interconnectors, the system won't be able to provide the sorts of affordable and reliable energy we need, and it won't be able to make the best use of the wonderful renewable sources we've got at different parts of the country. The second, in my view, is centrally planned and managed system strength. So at the moment in the NEM, we have the concept of generator do no harm, which intuitively makes a lot of sense. But what it's resulted in a practical level is a lot of small scale, inefficient technology solutions popping up all over the network, and often in the wrong place. And it's not solving the broader system strength network issue. So you mentioned policy, Paul. We are very active in the policy space. I think at any one time we're responding to more than 10 to 15 policy reviews. So there's a lot going on. We did submit a rule change earlier this year to the AEMC to move to a system-wide coordinated planning approach to deal with system strength. And I think if this is approved, it will make a significant difference, both in cost and reliability. And then the last solution, I think, is coordinated and facilitated large-scale renewable energy generation connected to the load centres. So we need very quickly to fill the gap in supply that's going to be there as coal retires, and we need it to be on a very large scale. We need them quickly. So we're really pleased to be working with the New South Wales government on renewable energy zones, and most recently the first one rolling out, which is the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone. And the level of demand from industry has been incredible, and I think has really proven that that chicken and egg problem of build it and they will come. But no one wants to come unless it's built, and no one wants to build the link unless there's people there to use it, has been a problem for so many years. And finally, it's been overcome through the state coming up with ideas to work outside of the existing system. So I think those three solutions will make a lot of difference.
Yeah, but Eva, well said. So the system strength, something that I have with a lot of clients battled with for the last 3 or 4 years, and to see basically, as you say, generator-sponsored responses to system strength and placing things like synchronous condensers in what I can only describe as odd places just really highlights that point. And in terms of system strength, I think that the determination from the AMC is due next month, I think, in terms of that rule request. It's already issued its main paper, but I think we're going to see quite significant changes there. And I personally quite like the concept that we're actually likely to move to a more centralized focus than this ad hoc process. James, I might throw to you then in terms of these requirements, and yeah, if you could comment upon that proposition.
Yeah, look, I think in terms of technology, we have what we need, right? The software is there, the automation, the feeder automation is there, the hardware is there. It's not a technology problem for us to solve. It's really a market structure problem to solve. And I think the point that Eva raised there around the chicken and egg is a great example. And when private enterprise can't solve the chicken and egg problem, that's what good government is there for, right? It's the government's role to step in, solve the chicken and egg problem, and then investors will come. And so I think that's a great example of where that's been done. I think from my perspective, it's the market that we need to change. And so we've seen the shift to 5-minute settlement. We saw some late attempts to delay it by various participants. We have the shift to the demand response mechanism, or the revisions to it, and the 2025 two-sided market. I think my comment there would be, we need to keep our foot on the accelerator with no slowing down. We can't slow down. We have to keep going.
Yeah, James, I think that's a really well-made point. And to me, one of the things that government's actually able to do here, and the electricity sector is a unique beast, because in fact, the market is created by legislation. In almost every other commodity market, it is driven out of bilateral arrangements, which then people have bolted on things, such as you look at gas, the STTM and the hubs and all those sort of things. They're bolt-ons to what have been basically bilateral trade. So from our point of view, I think markets are important, and the strength of energy markets and FCAS and things like that have been shown to be somewhat useful. But I might throw to Mauricio and sort of get some thoughts in terms of where else we need to go in terms of particularly development of markets. And what I'm really interested in, Mauricio, is sort of how we encourage new technology beyond wind, solar, etc., to do things, and your views, particularly on storage devices, syncons, that type of issues.
Thank you, Paul. And most of the big ticket items have been covered by Eva and James. If we get into technology, bringing new technology into the fray, our prediction would be that you could do that more on smart cities. Is in that convergence between e-mobility, particularly software control and hardware, power quality monitoring, and ancillary services sale. To do that, again, we talk about the theme is aggregation. If you can do that. Apart from that, the large scale technologies, I agree with James, they are relatively settled. Is more to do if you talk about satellite cities for mining towns, for argument's sake. Clarity on gas policy and pricing, that would go a long way to really tip the scale one way or the other. The other thing will be procurement processes. Then procurement processes both upstream of the infrastructure. Naturally, for new infrastructure, you need build, own, operate proponents. Then how open is the market for that? And then once you go downstream on the builders, who is building it, are we using perhaps outdated construction panels from the incumbent transmission companies? For instance, I commend Transgrid effort with Energy Connect. It has been widely recognized the procurement process that was followed attracted international market players, then it's those sort of things that we can do in terms of innovation commercially and innovation in terms of technology. I do believe it will be more on the front of orchestrated, aggregated DER at precinct level.
Excellent. Olivia, I might throw to you, and I suppose just issues in terms of both from distributed energy point of view, but I also might just ask you to, in talking about that, is just to talk about what barriers you see in terms of the contribution that distributed energy can make to the robust grid.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to stay in the DER corner of that discussion. So, and I think, you know, one of the main challenge is around DER today is the integration of distributed solar into the distribution network, and that creates a number of technical issues, and the main one is voltage. And as you briefly touched on, this was the focus of an arena study and project we finalized earlier this year in partnership with CityPower and PowerCo. So the report is available online on our website or Arena's website for the most curious of you. And in that report, I think we show there is quite a diversity of situations across the grid. However, I think we're quite convinced that a significant part of the grid will not be able to allow everyone to have solar PV on their roof as it is. So that means, you know, if we want to go there, and I think a lot of people want to go there, then that means some things need to change. And I agree that, you know, all of the technologies, or there are a lot of technologies that would allow it to be done. But I mean, I think the big question is which one to choose, which is the right one, how do you use it optimally, and how do you make sure that you don't overinvest or choose the shorter Mensa that is going to become stranded in no time just because of the amount of PV coming online. And I think so. Just to reflect on some of the recommendations and learnings stemming from that particular study. So what appeared as a definite winner is allowing flexible export. Today, we have what we would call static export limit. That is, networks are limiting either the connection or the capacity of the system just based on the worst case, just to be safe. And obviously, this is quite frustrating for customers, and maybe more importantly, or as importantly, this is not optimal from an economic perspective, because why would you restrain or constrain the export in a time where there is no need to? So I think this is definitely a massive step in the right direction, and a lot of networks are looking at that. And to do this, smart inverters are good stopgap measures in a way, because they will allow that flexible export and be able to take into account the local conditions of the grid to do this. However, what we've shown is that the smart inverters are not silver bullets, and you know, the fact that, you know, they're called smart inverters doesn't mean that, you know, they can do everything. What they do is they curtail the export when needed. But when we look at, and when based on our modeling, when we look at really high uptake of solar, in many cases, the smart inverter will be active in curtailing a lot of the export, sometimes, you know, potentially up to 80%, which doesn't make any sense from an economic perspective for the overall system, nor for the customer. You know, if the customer can connect, but they can connect and be curtailed 80% of the time, then it's not a good option. So I think, you know, they're a good solution, and it's a low cost measure that will enable to some uptake, but I think they're not a silver bullet, and some complementary measures will be required, be it from customer side or network side. And I think another learnings that we looked also at storage as a solution, and behind the Meta or customer side storage. And we only scratched the surface here for the storage, but what we did was look at what happens if a customer is using it purely as to maximize their self-consumption. And the answer is it doesn't help, because with the current sizing of energy storage devices, what happens is the storage, the battery fills up until noon, and then it stops doing anything. And this is right when the sun is shining at its brightest, and this is when the voltage problems are at their worst. So it doesn't mean that it can't do something, and it definitely can. I think the question becomes, as it was highlighted, how do you control storage to maximize these benefits in terms of DR integration? And traditionally, most of the orchestrated storage or active DER today are controlled more from a system perspective, that is driven by signal that stem from the market, be it FCAS or wholesale arbitrage and that sort of things. And it's only recently, or relatively recently, that you have networks that have started to reflect on sending these signals to active DER to be able to leverage them at a local level and to solve some of these DER and PV integration challenges.
Yeah. Olivia, look, I think that's a really interesting perspective. To me, one of the challenges we have is the extent to which you let market forces do what it should, and how people can actually, as individual consumers, take advantage of these types of arrangements. I think that's a real challenge in the system, and I think ESB absolutely sort of highlights, well, we've got some markets for some of the types of services we need, but the some support services we have either sort of bilateral contracted market, which doesn't really work. We have certain types of tests that make it difficult to participate when trying to look through that sort of holistic point of view of how we can actually utilize distributed energy, and particularly storage devices, is something that I sort of see as something that I still very much see as an untapped market. So Mauricio, I might just ask you to comment on that.
Yes, definitely. On the storage part, or yes, on the storage part, what we have seen is various challenges. The first one is in terms of investment. I mentioned upstream, some of the players, they are at a disadvantage. They build on operate players, internationals, because they don't have the understanding of the network that perhaps the locals would have. Also, from a technological point of view and a business case point of view, then arbitrage, I think by and large, everybody agrees that would not be able to get your batteries across the line from a financial modeling point of view and business case point of view. Then when you turn your mind to the ancillary services, fast response, frequency control, and things like that, is the level of commitments that you could get from the various agencies is limited. Then again, it makes it really hard. These are really big assets, really big investments to be put forward. But again, I have to commend states like South Australia, now the recent announcement in Victoria with 300 megawatt battery, albeit that is more in a central location or in a satellite setting. But yes, we do need those revenue streams to be settled for regulatory change to make sure that investment is appropriate in those areas.
And that might be interesting. And Ava, I'm going to segue to you, because we talk about barriers, and you obviously there's you've mentioned the ISP and the rollout of the ISP, but I note that Transgrid has actually put in a rule change request or a derogation in respect of financing of ISP, which again raises some interesting issues in terms of what are the barriers to actually getting to the robust grid.
Yes, thanks, Paul. I'm happy to comment on that, but I did want to pick up the comments on storage, and I agree the commercial proposition is challenging. It's not insurmountable, and it's getting easier, but storage is incredibly important, not just for the core service it provides, but also for system strength. So we, a couple of weeks ago, announced one of the world's largest battery systems to be installed on the grid to deal with inertia. So connected to the grid, this battery provides the synthetic inertia, which, for those who don't understand what inertia is, essentially it's it's a key element of system strength that's caused by the rotating turbines in the coal thermal generation. So as coal generation retires, we have a significant inertia problem on the network. Now we have a solution, and that comes in the form of large-scale batteries that provide sort of pretend inertia, I suppose. We call it synthetic inertia to resolve that problem. And interestingly, it's 80% cheaper than other solutions that we've been using before. So huge cost savings for consumers. But on to your other question, Paul, around barriers. As a relative newcomer to the electricity sector, I came from oil and gas. I was astounded by the complexity of it. And by that, I just mean the sheer numbers of players involved and the interplay between those players and the different agendas that each of them have. So you've got, state and federal governments, a number of departments in each, through to ESB, IPART, AEMO, AEMC, AER. Just getting my head around the acronyms to start with was hard, and then I had to figure out what they all did. So you've also got, of course, all the different organisations across the value chain playing different roles, and those roles all changing with the transition. So the complexity is a real challenge and a barrier, and financeability, of course. So we're looking at an absolutely unprecedented scale of investment in the network with the ISP projects. Look, there's circa $10 billion of capital infrastructure that is outlined in AEMO's plan. And our system has not been designed, our regulatory system has not been designed to cope with investment at that scale. And so when you look at the way depreciation's treated and inflation's treated, just by way of two examples in the regulatory system, they don't allow financeability of those large-scale projects. It works for augmentations and managing a capital portfolio over a 5-year regulatory period where you've got different types of projects with different profiles, but that level of scale is very complex, and hence the rule change that we needed to put in. So for me, it comes back to consumers. I mean, what they want is low-cost energy, and I think the complexity in the system is hampering the ability for us to deliver that to them and deliver it quickly.
Ava, that's absolutely well said. I mean, I think there is one of the issues I particularly see around this is in fact the test that we use in terms of the rollout of the grid, and certainly the derogation that's being sought by Transgrid just highlights to me things like rule systems that are set up for an existing grid, not for a grid that's in transition. And obviously the Victorians have already passed legislation to try to actually get around those types of things. So people are sort of really questioning the system that we set up in the national electricity market in the mid 1990s. James, I might throw to you about sort of your views on barriers and what we're doing, what we need to do to change things.
I think most of my peers, I'm thinking deeply because I think most of my peers have captured it. I think in terms of change, I'd say embrace the change, don't reject the change, right? Embrace digital, don't reject it. If we talk about synchronous condensers, not being disparaging about them, but they're not known as a cutting edge technology. And if we look at the example that Eva's just raised on having a battery in the network and it being 80% cheaper, I think that's a great example of where we can move to a digital solution rather than a traditional solution, which will decrease the overall cost to consumers and also achieve the technical outcomes that we need. And it's the same whether you go to small scale inverters or large scale. So I think embrace digital and embrace the change.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective, and I've got a bit of perspective because I had the pleasure of helping on the Ganawara energy storage system, which is still the only integrated renewable and battery project. And I did a presentation about a week ago, and when we were sort of looking at the new roadmap that was published by the feds on the low emissions roadmap. And unpicked that 3 years later and sort of said, does the system now allow for that to happen any easier? And the bizarre thing for me is the conclusion was probably not. And when you think about these sort of things, ultimately from a regulatory point of view, how do we actually achieve the sorts of outcomes where you actually have a fully functioning grid from that point of view. So, Mauricio, I might just get you to comment upon those, perhaps on a couple of those points.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Yes, the pace, there's definitely a discrepancy on the pace on the regulatory reform, even the economic assessment of assets, as Eva said as well, in relation to the ISP needs in terms of infrastructure. One of the other challenges that we haven't talked about is resourcing. It was not in the radar, let's say, for renewable generation, because the second part of the wave was solar, which doesn't require much effort, let's say, for resourcing. But EVA and Transgrid, for instance, will have a colossal challenge in the delivery now of Energy Connect. I have seen the histogram, let's say, for Energy Connect linesman is in the order of 1,200 strong FTE full-time employees for a period of over 2 years. Then even the barriers of entry of many of the resources into the country, our estimation is there will be at least 400 to 500 resources required in the country. We're talking about skilled resources to deliver that sort of project, and it will be just a peak, and then it will die off to service all the smaller interconnectors. Then that perhaps that challenge hasn't been addressed.
Olivia, I've got a couple of questions come in, and I think, again, given your work you've done on DER, one of the questions is, do you think local councils actually have more of an active role to play in the years to come in setting up mutualised storage to collect private solar and sort of almost, I think it leads to VPPs and the like?
Yeah, look, the question is as I understand, is about the emergence of community schemes, which I think has been a trend recently. I think typically, so you have a number of trials and things that are ongoing in Australia. I think Ausgrid has a community battery project going on, where they want to allow customers to tap into that kind of community resource. I think for me there are two questions. It's what's the value of this, and then how do you make it happen? I think the value of this would be the same whatever the business model in a way. I think if you put a battery there, it needs to be solving a real constraint. Otherwise, it's fairly virtual as a value stream. And after this, there is the question of how do you what is the business model? And today, basically, whatever the path length of the electron on the grid is not taken into account in the tariff. So as soon as you got the electron crossing a meter somewhere, then you're going to have a toll to pay. So definitely there is not a lot of it's not easy to make it happen and to allow these sort of short path exchanges. And you have a lot of and basically the only way to do this today, or maybe the simplest, is just to privatize the chunk of network you're interested in and turn it into a what is called an embedded network in Australia. You have a number of initiatives globally. Germany, France have some specific tariff or some initiative to try and enable this sort of local exchange on a public grid. But it's highly complex because it's a lot more complex in terms of tariff and pricing and for the customers. And I think the question in the end is going to be, is it worth it? And I don't know. I think some customers want it, and there's definitely some leeway in improving the situation. But yeah, it's an interesting development, and I think some of the value that it could bring is in particular in non-single unit housing to give access to customers to PV or storage. It's a lot easier to do this in a rural home, or when you've got a big house with a garden, than when you're at the third floor of a building. So I think there is definitely some value in some things that it can enable. So there is some value in it, but today it's difficult in the current regulatory and pricing environment to make it happen in a financially viable fashion.
Thanks, Olivia. I'll close at that stage. I think it's the opening proposition I said was we're on a wave of transition, and it's been fair to say for each one of the presenters today, we have talked about a wide range of things, which really goes to, I think, highlight the change that is occurring both from sort of industry perspective and a regulatory perspective, and trying to really deal with things that like the ESB is grappling with and what the market's going to look like so that we can actually manage this transition. So in particular, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Ava, Mauricio, James, and Olivia. I think it's been a great discussion. I think amongst the four of us, we could continue to talk for a long time, but we have to stop. I would also like to thank the French-Australian Chamber of Commerce for organising this event as part of the overall conference. Also, in particular, thank Schneider Electric as the naming rights sponsor for this forum. And finally, the French Embassy, Austrade, and their sponsors for their support throughout the conference. And thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Thanks very much.